אנחנו מוצאים את הספור עם זרה שמשון?
האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה? מה? כן.
Erev Tov, good evening, everyone. We're in the Zera Shimshon Parsha Tazria, Os Dalid. That's section number 4. Before we begin, we're going to read 2 psukim from Parsha Tazria. This is Vayikra Perek Yud Gimel psukim Aleph and Beis. Vayadaber Hashem el Moshe v'el Aharon lemor, and Hashem spoke to Moshe and to Aaron, saying, Odom ki yiyeh ve'or b'soro, a person when there will be in his skin se'es o sapachas o vaheres. Those words are not really translatable, so we're going to say they're kind of skin patches on the skin, but they're highly detailed descriptions to understand what kind of skin patches. So if he has a se'es skin patch or a sapachas skin patch or a vaheres skin ailment or patch, v'hoya ve'or b'soro l'nega tzaras, and there will be in the flesh, in the skin of his flesh, the tzaras affliction. So if these skin patchy spots, these skin patch areas are diagnosed to reflect tzaras, or might be tzaras, v'huva el Aaron HaKohen, then he will be brought to Aaron the Kohen, O el achad mibonav hakohanim, or to one of Aharon's sons who were also kohanim. So basically, if you had a kind of skin patch that you thought might be tzaras, or people thought might be tzaras, they would bring you to one of the kohanim to decide, using the Torah procedures as outlined in this parsha, how to treat it, how to handle it, what to do. And to figure out if you actually had tzaras, and if so, what to do, and if you didn't have tzaras, to free you from that concern. So let's jump right into Os Dalid in the Zera Shimshon section number 4. Medrash Rabbah. The Medrash Rabbah says, Al Pasuk Adam ki yiyeh ve'or b'saro, the Pasuk we just read, a man or a person when there will be in the skin of his flesh one of these, possibly one of these tzaras patches. So the Medrash Rabbah comments, Hadohu dichsiv. This is what is written. This pasuk in the Torah reflects a pasuk in Mishlei, Nachonu laleitzim shefatim. Judgments are prepared and ready for the scoffers. If a person is a scoffer, makes fun of the Torah, makes fun of the laws of Hashem, then judgments, meaning punishments, are ready for that person, v'chule, etc. And the Medrash Rabbah continues, Kevan sheshamu Yisrael parashas negoyim, since when the Jewish people heard the section in the Torah of negoyim, of afflictions, of skin afflictions, which is from starting in our Parsha of Tazria, nisyaru, they became afraid. Amar lahem Moshe al tisyaru. Moshe said to them, do not be afraid. Elu le'umos ha'olam. These skin diseases are for the umos ha'olam, the nations of the world. Avalatem, but you, lechol v'lishtos v'lismoach. You will be able to eat and drink and rejoice. Ad kan Lashono, until here is a quote from the Medrash Rabbah. So before we even get to the Zera Shimshon, 3 questions coming up in the next paragraph, certainly all of us can understand that this is a hard little piece of Medrash Rabbah to understand, because what in the world is Moshe talking about, that tzaras is for the umos ha'olam, and Bnei Yisrael will be eating and drinking and rejoicing, and we'll see now the 3 questions. Top of the next column, Makshim. The commentators asked the following questions. This is number 1. Ma inyan lechol v'lishtos lekan, which is what we just pointed out. What is the connection to eating and drinking here? We're talking about tzaras. We're talking about a terrible skin affliction. And Moshe is talking about eating and drinking and rejoicing. What's the possible connection? That's question 1. Uma inyan hamora shehayalohem. Question 2. And what was this fear that Bnei Yisrael had? After all, Bnei Yisrael, we would think, had become quite used to hearing about different mitzvos in the Torah and different sections in the Torah, and along with the possible punishments or things that might happen to people based on what they might do. So why did they suddenly have this fear when they heard the Parsha of Tzaras? Now, question 3, V'od yesh lahakshos, and there's another question to ask. My kasha al pasuk. What was the question or problem with the pasuk Adam kiyev or besaro? A man, when he will have in the skin of his flesh a kind of skin ailment. When that pasuk, what was the problem? Shehevi alav hapasuk nachonu laleitzim shvatim, that the Medrash Rabbah decided to bring in the pasuk from Mishlei about judgments and punishments being all ready and prepared for scoffers and for sinners. What the Medrash Rabbah, in other words, to kind of paraphrase this question, must have seen some problem with the pasuk, some indication in the pasuk that there was a need to connect it in order for us to understand the pasuk better, to connect it to the pasuk in Mishlei about punishments, being ready for sinners, being prepared and all ready for sinners. But the Zera Shimshon says it's not apparent, it's not clear what the problem is in the pasuk about a person getting tzaras that would lead us to that would seemingly lead the Medrash Rabbah to bring in the pasuk from Mishlei. So those are the Zera Shimshon's 3 questions. V'yesh lomar, and we can say dekashile al pasuk zeh, that the question on the pasuk, on our pasuk, is Shehayilo lichtov adam im yihiyeh. The Torah should have written, if a person will have patches or skin ailment or patches, v'chosav ki yihiyeh, but the Torah did not write, if a person will have these skin patches. The Torah wrote ki yihiyeh, when a person will have these patches. Demashma, which implies shemin haro'oi hu sheyihiyeh lahem negoyim, which implies that it's going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Min haroi, the Torah is implying that it is appropriate for Bnei Yisrael to receive these skin patches and the affliction of tzaras, because it doesn't say if it happens, it says when it happens. So that was the Medrash Rabbah's a problem with the pasuk. Kemoshe Kosuv, and that's exactly what's written in the pasuk in Mishlei that the Medrash Rabbah brought. Nachonu laleitzim shvatim. Punishments are all ready and prepared to afflict the sinners and scoffers. So the Zera Shimshon answered his last question, his 3rd question first. And he says the Medrash Rabbah was bothered with our pasuk simply because it said the word ki yihiyeh instead of im yihiyeh. It said when there will be a skin affliction, as opposed to if there will be a skin affliction. And the Medrash Rabbah said, oh, okay, so the Torah is assuming that the people will get these skin afflictions and deserve them, and therefore deserve punishment, and therefore the Medrash Rabbah brought in the pasuk from Mishlei, which says exactly that. People who are sinners and scoffers, punishments are all ready and waiting for them. Okay. Umishum ki nisyaru. And it's also because of these words, ki yihiyeh, that the Torah used when there will be a skin affliction, that Bnei Yisrael became afraid. The mashma shehem leitzim, because that implies that they are scoffers and sinners, v'shenachonu lahem hashvatim, and that judgments and punishments are all prepared and ready for them. So the Zera Shimshon here is answering his 2nd question, and he's saying, why did Bnei Yisrael become particularly afraid? Because usually when the Torah, in general, when the Torah tells us, teaches us, when Hashem teaches us in the Torah about a certain mitzvah, a certain law, it says, if you do this aveira, if you do this sin, then there might be a certain punishment attached to it. But it doesn't assume that the people are going to do the sin. It doesn't say when you break Shabbos, for example, here's what's going to happen. It tells if a person does break Shabbos, or if a person does eat on Yom Kippur, or if a person does violates any of the particular mitzvos and commandments in the Torah, then what the punishment is, that the consequences of their actions might be. But here, Bnei Yisrael took particular note of the fact that the Torah said, when you get these skin ailments, meaning you're already considered like leitzim, you're already considered like scoffers and sinners who are going to deserve your punishment. So they became afraid. Umikol shkein shekosav hazohar, and how much more can we understand that they became afraid based on an excerpt from the Zohar, which the Zera Shimshon is going to bring in now. Al pasuk Adam kiyev or besaro. The Zohar also comments on the pasuk that we read about a person having a affliction of the skin and patches in the skin that could be tsaras. And the Zohar says as follows: Rabbi Chia v'Rebbi Yossi havu ozlei be'orcha. Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi were walking on the road, v'chule, etc. Adehavu azle, as they were walking, or while they were walking, iaru bechad barnash. They happened to come upon a certain person, ve'apohi malyan machtishin, and this individual's face was full of marks or sores. They passed a person and they noticed that this person was struck with some kind of skin affliction and his face was covered with sores. Amar Rabbi Yossi, so Rabbi Yossi said to Rabbi Chia, Vadai chata'ahu, this individual must certainly be a sinner. The ilav hachi, because if he was not a sinner, lo isrishimu an pohi, his face would not be marked be'ilin marin bishin, with these terrible signs of affliction. Ve'ilin, and these signs on his face, lo ikrun yisurin de ahava, they are not considered afflictions of love. Ad kan lashono, until here is a quote from the Zohar. So let's pause for a moment to bring in, or to refer to a Gemara in Masechta Brachos on Daf Hey, where the Gemara talks about the concept of Yisurin Shel Ahava, afflictions of love. And the Gemara says that if a person is afflicted with tsaras, that people can see skin if a person's skin on places of the body, such as the face or the hands or other places that people can readily see, if a person receives that, then that is not considered Yisur and Shalava. Those are not punishments of love, because Hashem would not do that to a person whom he loved. And the Gemara there talks about that sometimes Hashem will bring Yisurin, will bring suffering on a righteous individual in order for the person to receive more schar in the next world. And it's a very unusual concept and a very interesting discussion. And I encourage you to take a look at the Gemara over there. Again, that's Brachos Daf Hey, in order to see more about that. But the point that the Zera Shimshon is making from the Zohar is to say that we see that when a person has afflictions on the skin that other people can see, they must be doing something wrong. They must be sinning in some way, because that's not an example of Yisur and Shel Ahava. It's not an example of a kind of suffering that Hashem might bring on a righteous individual in order to increase that individual's reward in the next world. So therefore, the Zera Shimshon says that helps us understand how much more so Bnei Yisrael had fear, had yira, when they heard the parsha of Tzaras, because they said, the Torah is assuming, Hashem is assuming that we're sinners and we deserve Tzaras and we deserve this affliction and everything that comes along with it, based on the fact that the Torah said, ki yihiyeh, when there will be, as opposed to im yihiyeh, if there will be. And now the Zera Shimshon continues, V'im kain tigala kilonenu lakol. If so, if we, Bnei Yisrael, reasoned and thought, if we are already considered sinners who deserve these skin afflictions, then our humiliation will be revealed to everyone. Ve'afilu chayos hasodeh yecholos oz lishlot bonu. And if we are marked, so to speak, with signs of sin, and anyone who looks at us can see the signs on our skin, then even wild animals will be able to attack us and to dominate us. Umishum hachi, and because of this, Amar lahem, and because of this, Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, Af al pisha ba'olam hazeh, Eino noheg din negoyim ba'umos, even though in this world, in our time, meaning in Moshe's time and continuing now in our time, the laws of these skin afflictions do not apply to the nations of the world. Even though that's true, Mikol Makam, nevertheless, Kosav Kra, the pasuk here, when it talks about people who are ready to receive punishments and skin afflictions, it's talking al shem ha'asid. It's talking of a future time. She'asidin ha'umos lilkos bin negoyim, when the nations of the world will be struck with skin afflictions, v'yisgala kilonam, and their humiliation will be revealed to everyone. So the Zera Shimshon is going to continue, of course, but let's pause to understand what he's saying. He's saying an amazing thought and very novel and new idea, that when the Torah begins here in Parsha Tazria to delineate, to discuss, to describe the skin afflictions of tsaras and how they need to be handled, it actually is hinting to us that these are punishments that will apply to the umos ha'olam in the achris hayomim, at the end of days, and that's when they will receive these skin afflictions, but not us. At that time, Bnei Yisrael will not be punished with any kind, will not suffer from any kind of tsaras or skin affliction. And as he continues in the next paragraph, Aval Yisrael, but Klal Yisrael, le'echol v'lishtos v'lismoach, they will be eating and drinking and rejoicing in the achris hayomim, at the end of days when the umos ha'olam are suffering and being punished. The Amrinon Biksubos, because we say, and Chazal say in the Gemara Masechta Ksubos Perak Afal Pi, in the chapter called Afal Pi, here's what the story from that Gemara. A very unusual story coming up. Please brace yourselves. Amemar Umar Zutra v'Rav Ashi. Amemar and Mar Zutra and Rav Ashi havu yasve apischa debe izgor malka. These three great leaders of the Babylonian Jewish community were sitting near the doorway of Isgor Malka, Isgor the king of that time. Cholif ve'ozil aturniga de Malka. The butler, or the waiter of the king's special waiter, was passing back and forth, bringing the king food. So the waiter was apparently coming from a separate kitchen area, a separate place where the food was being prepared. And he was bringing the food and passing back and forth in front of these great Amoraim, these great scholars. Chazia Rav Ashi Lamar Zutra. So Rav Ashi saw that one of the other scholars, Rav Zutra, Mar Zutra, de Chavar Ape, his face was turning white. He was becoming weak. He was becoming faint. Shokil ba'etz ba'ase. So he took some of the food off the platter of the waiter who was passing by with his finger. Anachle bipume, and he put it in the mouth of Mar Zutra, so that Mar Zutra would have a little food and would become strengthened and would not faint and would not get weaker. Omar lehu, he said to them, "My taima samachta anisa. Why did you rely on a miracle?" Now, to understand that question, we need to know a little piece of the Gemara that the Zera Shimshon left out, because once again, the Zera Shimshon assumes if he quotes a Gemara or almost any other source, he assumes we know it, and he doesn't have to quote it verbatim. So we need to add a little part. What happened, according to the narrative that we read about, is that Rav Ashi stuck his finger in the king's food and took some off and gave it to Mar Zutra. When he was challenged by the waiter and the king's servants and said, "What do you think you're doing? You just stuck your finger into the food intended for us to bring to the king, which now you've ruined it. So the Gemara, again, the part that this we didn't see, this is the part that Zera Shimshon doesn't quote. So Rav Ashi answered and said, look, let me show you this food, this meat that you were bringing to the king is actually unfit to be served to him because there's a skin disease. There's like a type of tsaras on the skin of the animal that you must have missed. It's like covered with gravy. And then he reached up and turned over the meat. And in fact, they saw the skin disease. Now, that was a miraculous act to protect him and the other rabbis because there was no skin disease. And of course, that's not why he stuck his finger into the food. He stuck his finger into the food to help Mar Zutra. So after he did that, and the other rabbis realized that a miracle had happened to save him, they asked him and they said, and here we can go back into the text. Amar luhu mai taima samachta aniso. Why did you rely on a miracle that by saying the meat had a kind of tsaras, a kind of skin ailment, and then that Hashem did a miracle to save you, but without the miracle, you probably would have been executed, perhaps with the other rabbis, because you lied, number one, and number two, you stuck your finger in the king's food. Amar luhu. He said to them, Chazoi ruach tzaras de kaparich ilove. He said, I saw a spirit of tzaras that was kind of blossoming or surrounding him. Upirish Rashi ilove de Mar Zutra. Rashi says, who's the him? It's a reference to Mar Zutra, meaning that Rav Ashi looked over at Mar Zutra and saw that he was becoming faint. He was becoming white and weak and faint. And then he said he saw that there was a spirit of tsaras surrounding him. He didn't yet have the actual skin ailment of tsaras, but it was a kind of haze of tsaras was surrounding him. And that's why he knew he had to move immediately to do what he did. And that's why he was a somech. That's why he relied on a miracle to save him, because he felt like he was doing something that absolutely, it was an emergency crisis situation, and he had to act the way that he did. Now let's continue. Actually, let's pause for a moment. The reason the Zera Shimshon brings in this very unusual and remarkable Gemara from Masechta Ksubos is to teach us that the reason Mar Zutra became weak and white-faced and had this haze of tsaras around him was because he was very hungry, and then he saw food passing by and going back and forth, and this hunger for food that he could not eat brought him close to actually almost breaking out in a skin ailment of tsaras. So we learned from that Gemara that there's a connection between hunger and seeing people eating food and not being able to eat it that can bring tsaras on a hungry person in that situation. Let's continue on the top of the next column. V'hachi namiksi. And we see a reference to this also in a pasuk in Yeshayahu. Hine avoda yochelu, behold, my servants will eat, ve'atem tiravu, and you will be hungry. Meaning in the future days, the Umos HaOlam, the Navi is prophesying that the Umos HaOlam will be hungry and suffering, while Bnei Yisrael, the servants of Hashem, will be eating and enjoying food. Umisha roa ma'acholim, someone who sees food that people are eating, ve'eno ochel, and he is not eating, he's not allowed to eat the food, hu bisakona lios mitzora, he is in danger of becoming a person with tsaras. Aval misha ochel v'shoseh v'sameach, but someone who at that time is eating and drinking and rejoicing, ein lo sibo lios mitzora, there is no reason whatsoever for that person to become a mitzora. Umushum hachi amar lahem, and that's why Moshe said, now where he's going back to the Medrash Rabbah, that's why Moshe said in the Medrash Rabbah, Al tisyaru, do not be afraid of all these laws of tsaras and discussions of skin diseases. Elu, these things are intended for the Umos HaOlam in the future and not for you. You in the future at the end of days will be eating and drinking and rejoicing. And it's because the Umos HaOlam will be suffering and not allowed to eat and join you in the celebration and eat any of the food and drinking, that they will then start suffering from leprosy, because as the Zera Shimshon established based on the Gemara and Ksubas, there is a connection between watching others eat and watching food go by and being hungry and not being allowed to eat it. There's a connection between that situation and developing tsaras. So at this point, the Zera Shimshon has fully answered his original three questions. And in a nutshell, just to quickly recap, basically what changes, everything is based on the wording in the Torah of ki yihiyeh, when there will be tsaras, when Bnei Yisrael will suffer from tsaras, and that's what made Bnei Yisrael afraid, and that's what and that's why the Medrash Rabbah brought in the pasuk from Mishlei about punishments being ready for the sinners, and that helps us understand why Moshe Rabbeinu said to Bnei Yisrael, "Don't be afraid. Everything you're reading here is going to apply to the Umos HaOlam, not to you in the future, which is the time that we're always focused on and concerned about, the Achris HaYomim, the end of days, and also, of course, Olam Haba, the next world, the world to come. That's when the Umos HaOlam will suffer these punishments of skin ailments and diseases. And Bnei Yisrael, at that time, you won't have to worry a bit about any tsaras, because you'll be eating and drinking and celebrating and being rewarded for being Avdei Hashem, for being servants of Hashem." Now the Zera Shimshon moves on a different track, and he suggests an alternative possibility to understand the psukim. V'od yesh lomar, and there's another thing that can be said. De'in hachinami de'mayre kra af b'olam hazeh. We can concede and say the psukim are actually talking about in this world as we know it. We don't have to say that the psukim can only be referring to a future time in the Achris HaYomim, at the end of days. It can actually be talking about our own time and in the time of the Torah. Lefi sheyesh negoyim haboyim derech teva, because there are certain skin afflictions that come to a person in a natural way. Lemisha ochel shkotzim veramosim. It comes to people who eat bugs and insects. Kemoshe nichtov lekaman b'samach, as we will write in the next piece, which is Os Hey in the Zera Shimshon. He'll discuss that idea. V'ayin sham, you should look over there. Ve'elu yavo dafka l'nochrim, and these types of skin ailments will only come to Nochrim, to non-Jews, ve'aleihem omar akos of ki yihiyeh, and it is in a reference to them that the Torah used the noteworthy language of when there will be, as opposed to if there will be. Why? Because they were very used to eating, and it was common for them to eat all kinds of bugs and insects, and that's why it said That's why it said when you'll get saras. It was a reference to them. Omnam, however, Yisrael she'enam ochlim shkotzim. However, Bnei Yisrael that generally did not eat bugs and insects. Of course, parenthetically, we know that certain grasshoppers are actually kosher, and certainly were kosher. The Torah teaches that, and presumably were eaten by the people when they were able to collect them and come across them. Nonetheless, it was an exception to the general rule of the strong prohibitions against eating bugs and insects. So Bnei Yisrael yecholim lechol kol ma'acholim. So Bnei Yisrael could eat all of their usual normal foods, beli pachad v'chashash, without any fear and without any concern of contracting tsaras, shelo yovi lohem hanegoyim, so that the skin afflictions would not affect them. So with this explanation, the Zera Shimshon is saying, even if we put aside, or even if we say in addition to the explanation about the Achris HaYomim, the end of days in the future, we can even learn the psukim in the phrase ki yihiyeh, the two words ki yihiyeh, when there will be, as a reference to the Umos HaOlam, even at the time when Moshe said the words, and even in our own time, because of this issue of insect and bug consumptions. We're moving to the last paragraph now. And because there's a different type of skin affliction, that comes because of a person's personal and individual sin, meaning that we talked about the type of tsaras that can come because of a person being hungry and not being able to eat food. We talked about a type of tsaras that can come because a person eats bugs and insects. And now the Zera Shimshon, it says, and there's another type of tsaras, of course, which afflicts an individual because of a sin he committed. Mishum hachi, because of this, nitan din hanigoyim liyisrael v'lo le'umos. That's why these laws are presented here in the Torah for Bnei Yisrael and not for the Umos HaOlam. In order that they should learn how to receive atonement when they commit a sin and are struck with, or I should say, if they commit a sin and are struck with tsaras. Im yasu mashakosov b'parsha, if they do the procedures and follow the laws in this parsha of Parshas Tzaras, then they'll learn how to attain kapara, how to attain atonement for the sins that led the individual to be afflicted with tzaras. As it says in the Gemara in Maseches Brachos, and here's the Gemara we mentioned before that the Zohar was connected to, the Gemara in Masechta Brachos Taf Hey. The Gemara says over there, the Negoyim Havu Mizbeach Kapara. When a person receives skin afflictions because of a sin that he or she committed, and we know that tzaras is connected, Chazal connected in many cases to speaking Lashon Hara. So if that happens, then the Negoyim have a Mizbeach Kapara. Then receiving the skin affliction is like having access to an altar of forgiveness. So even after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, if a person is struck with the affliction of tzaras, that's a way to bring, a powerful way to bring kapara to the person. V'chein hahu uvdu shel hazohar, and so too the episode that's quoted in the Zohar, Hanizkar La'el, which was mentioned previously, the Zohar talked about an important, prominent person, a righteous individual who was struck with negoyim, lechaparas cheto, and it was in order to bring atonement for a sin that he had committed. But the Zera Shimshon's point is that we should not view tzaras as a terrible punishment, or think that when it says Bnei Yisrael was afraid and had yira, had great fear when they heard the Parsha of Tzaras, we shouldn't view Tzaras in that sense. We should view Tzaras as a wonderful, effective way to bring kapara for a person who committed an avera and was punished with Tzaras. When is Tzaras a terrible thing, and when is it ready to jump right on people and afflict them with suffering? That the Medrash Rabbah taught us was for the Umos HaOlam, either in the future at the end of days, according to the first explanation of the Zera Shimshon, or even in the time of the Torah and in our own times, Ba'olam Hazeh, according to the second explanation of the Zera Shimshon. Yasher koach to everyone for participating in our learning tonight. We look forward, God willing, to learning again together in the Zera Shimshon next week.